Hi class, in this video I'll be walking you through the basic steps of blocking out your colors using chalk pastels and then mapping out the bright and the dark areas using color temperature. So your first step is to block your base color. So you need to figure out what your base colors are going to be. This is not going to be the final color. It's just going to be the color into which you build or layer everything else. Now notice I've got my pencil lines still showing here in my drawing of these pairs. If your lines are a little dark, make sure that you do go over and erase anything extraneous, soften some of those edges with your eraser, and if you were using the grid, make sure that you erase all of those grid lines. Your mark should have been pretty light to begin with, so you wanted to avoid indenting the paper, and we just erase the pencil lightly first so that it doesn't end up mixing with the color as we go. So to block out, you can use the side of your pastel. You can use the tip of it, sort of like a pencil. I like to do a little bit of both, and this is very sketchy, very loose start to our image. And you want to make sure that you block out the color throughout the entire page. This is just one way of working with pastels, and I'll tell you why we do this. First of all, it makes you feel pretty good to look down and within 20 or 30 minutes, all of a sudden you've got like color everywhere, right? You feel this sense of accomplishment. But also, and more importantly, you see how those colors are going to interact with each other. This is called color relativity. So you're able to develop your entire image with an awareness of how the subjects interact with one another. You won't end up, drawing the most beautiful pair and then having it get overwhelmed by your background. By rendering everything in, blocking everything in at the same time, you see how the colors are going to look when they're paired up with each other. And you can react to those color pairings and increase or decrease the intensity and value as needed. So I am imagining that my pairs are sitting on a pink cloth, and I know it looks a little orange in the video, but I'll post some photos to our course homepage of each step so that you can see how this develops. In the background, I want to stay away from using black or white at this point in time, unless of course that's a color that you need in order to create your base. For instance, I need white to make pink, right? I'm also going to use a little bit of white in my background for the purple. So I've chosen two different colors here that vary in terms of their color temperature. Red is a warm color, and when I add white to it, it creates a tint, which is pink. Okay, so red and white equals a tint. And pink is a warm color, right? Purple is a cool color. So if you remember from class, cool colors recede, warm colors come forward. So already I'm using color temperature to establish the space. That's blocking it out. It's as simple as that. There's color everywhere, and now I can respond by beginning to map out the color temperature. So I like to map out the colors, and I'm going to leave these pairs at different states so you can see how it develops. But I like to map out the colors first by using my cool colors. And if you'll notice the way that I've got my pastels arranged here, I've separated the cool colors from the warm colors. Not only is this visually pleasing, it looks like a little rainbow, but it's going to make your life a lot easier as you're reaching for colors. You're not going to be searching amidst a big mess. So when I'm working through my cool colors, right, my base is cool for the pears. I want to move progressively through those cool colors. So I'll start with the greens and then I'll go to my blues, and I'll start with the lighter blue and then the darker blue. And I will end with a little bit of purple. Essentially in this mapping phase, you are moving through all the colors of the rainbow, starting from the inner part of the rainbow out, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. By having all of the colors in your image, even if it doesn't arbitrarily have those, but by mixing all of the colors together, you're going to have a really dense, really velvety looking image. And you'll see that develop in the second part of this video. All right, so color mapping. I'm going to come to my pear, and everywhere that I think it needs to be darker, I'm going to mark out with this green, this deeper sort of like hunter green. And I'll leave my little pear alone because I want to see what it looks like just in the initial blocking phase. Notice how quickly I am moving through my page and how I kind of bounce from one pear to the next. Also, make sure that you are putting this color anywhere that you see it's going to be darker. Okay, so in the end, my shadow is not going to be green, but I want to get that down just so I have an idea of where it will eventually go. One other thing I do want to point out, the whites of the paper that I left. Sometimes I do this, sometimes I get really excited about color and I forget to do that. So if you've been left without any pure white areas for highlight, you could always go in at this point and subtract some of the pigment out, right? You could take your kneaded eraser, and before things get too busy, you could pull out some pigment. But what I would suggest is just to come back at the end with a little bit of heightening, because as time goes on, these white areas, they'll eventually get covered up either on purpose or by accident, just because of the nature of this pastel material. The most time will be spent in mapping in the very first part, because you're marking out everywhere that it's going to be dark with that first color. And then from there, you'll just move progressively down your colors, layering over where you've already said it's going to be dark. Okay, so that first step of mapping the darks using color temperature, you've already established where everything's going to go. And now you just have to follow what you've set forth for yourself. Now I'm working from a photograph that I took of a still life. If you're inventing the scene, then you're the architect of how the color mapping goes. If you're working from a visual resource, use that as a guide. And remember, you can move back and forth between the edge of your pastel and these little sketchy marks. I like to actually have a little bit of both in my drawings when they're finished. I tend to use the darkest colors more sparingly, and that's a result of this process that we're using. It'll keep you from going overboard on the darks. You can always add more dark, but it's harder to bring something back once it's got a lot of dark parts in it. The reason this process helps you from letting the dark areas overwhelm your image is because, once again, in that first phase of the mapping, you've established where all of the darkest areas will be. And then progressively you're adding less and less of each cool color until you end with your purple. Unless, of course, purple is your base, then you would start with purple. But you add the purple, and that helps to create some contrast. And we'll come back to some of these colors as the drawing progresses. All right, now we've done the cool colors. We want to move to our warm colors. And we've only got 3 warm colors to deal with. We've got yellow, we've got orange, and we've got red. So I'm working with these little chunks of pastel. When these shipped to me, some of them broke in shipment. They're pretty delicate, even though they're hard pastels, because there's not a lot of binder, which is why the colors are so vibrant. They do tend to break, but they'll also break as you're working with them. So if that happens, don't worry about it. They're actually easier to use when they're smaller. All right, so now our warm colors for the mapping. Anywhere that I see it needs to be brighter, I'm going to block that in with my warm color. And remember, we're not just focusing on the main subject, right, the area of emphasis. You're also developing these colors in the foreground and the background. Where yellow mixes with purple, it's going to end up neutralizing that color. We'll talk about that in the second video. All right, so the yellow is done, and now just like the cool colors, progressively I'm going to add less and less of each of these warm colors. In my photo, I can actually see that some of the pink is reflecting or casting itself back up onto the orange, or onto the pear. So I'm going to capture that with a little bit of orange, and then I'll end with my red. So this video, because I've been talking, it's going a little longer than I would normally take for this step. A drawing this size, this is 16 by 20, but the actual image size is a little bit smaller. It shouldn't take you too long to do the initial mapping, maybe 10-15 minutes tops. If you're working on an 18 by 24 and things are pretty complicated, maybe it'll take you a half hour. But the point is, you don't want to spend a really long period of time on this part of the drawing, because it's going to change. This is just a general idea of where everything is going to live and what your drawing is going to be. So block out your base, map out your warm and your cool colors, and as a final step before you store this drawing, you could do a little bit of blending, right? So right now there's a lot of pigment, a lot of dust on my paper. And in the dark areas, I'm going to take my kneaded eraser and just pull that pigment out, because look at what happens when you smear it, right? You can actually draw with the material that's on your paper. You can draw with what gets onto your kneaded eraser as well. If you don't want that to happen, like maybe you're switching from the shadows into the pear where it's warm and bright and you don't want any blue mixing in, knead your eraser, right? Pull it apart like silly putty. It'll absorb that color, and then you can switch to a different part, right? You can go right over to pink without muddying up the pink with your shadow. Blending around and pushing around the pigment, it's not required, and some people don't ever blend their images. I like to do this after the first step, only because I like to make use of the pigment that's on the surface. And right now I'm working on a very smooth paper, which isn't ideal for pastel because it doesn't have a tooth to hold the pigment to the surface. So I'm relying on my eraser to kind of push the pigment down and adhere as much as I can to my drawing. One last thing is this. We've moved through blocking out of your base color, right? We did that. We mapped out the color temperature. Check. The next step, which we'll get to in our next class, is refining. by adding more details, adding value, and returning to the base color to create sort of a sandwich where instead of having all of these arbitrary colors sitting on top, you go back in with your base color and you sort of seal them down in the surface. The next video in this series will cover these steps, so you can watch it ahead of time if you'd like. Before you store your drawing, you want to get rid of that dust. Do not blow the dust. You never want to blow the pigment dust. Take it up, tap it. Ideally, you don't want to tap it on your drawing surface because, right, you've got all that dust now. So have a garbage can handy. But if you saw when I tapped it, the dust just sort of fell off of the paper. Sometimes it can streak the paper, especially if you have a lot of dark pigment falling over a light area. Don't worry about that. That'll get fixed in the next step. Okay, so whether you choose to blend it or leave it rough after your initial blocking and mapping with color temperature, that's totally up to you. All right, thanks for watching.